Психоделія подкаст.
Вітаю вас, шановні слухачі, це подкаст «Психоделія». Сьогодні у нас в гостях з'явиться ветеран Джон Любекі, який закінчив служити в 2006 році і, повернувшись, з'ясував, що він страждає від важкого ПТСР, резистентного, який складно вилікувати. Але після 3 сесій МДМА він позбавився цього недугу, цього ПТСРу, і зараз є цілком здоровою людиною, який співпрацює з МЕПС, а також допомагає Україні перемогти і побував вже на Сході. Ми не пропагуємо вживати психоделічні речовини або будь-які заборонені речовини. Ми також виступаємо за зниження шкоди у разі вживання. В студії, як завжди, з вами Андрій Полюхівський і Данило Хомутовський.
Okay. I call you John, but I see that your name is Jonathan. How is it comfortable for you to call you?
Yeah, John's fine.
John, okay. So, first of all, I want to thank you, John, for the help to win in this war, to Ukraine, to Ukrainians, to us. Thank you for sharing your experience and your story to us and to everybody, because you were one of the heroes of the documentary How to Change Your Mind on Netflix, and that was a big documentary for many people, I think, in case of knowing better the PIT. I mean, psychedelic assisted therapy. And thank you very much.
Oh, not a problem. It was an honor to be included in the Netflix How to Change Your Mind. And it's been interesting because the reason I was included, everything honestly wasn't my choice. And what I mean by that is, I mean, they asked me if I wanted to be in it, but, you know, I didn't have a choice whether I got PTSD, you know, all the things that I've gone through after I was healed from PTSD weren't really my choice until I just decided to roll with it. And it was my choice to go to Ukraine, but I had a lot of traumatic things happen even before that. Had someone drown in the lake behind my house. I tried to intervene and save him. There was a shooting in downtown Charleston. I intervened there. And those were things that just happened. So when I had the opportunity to go over to Ukraine and to help people, I just couldn't say no. So, and I'm glad I did. And actually, I'm planning on heading back for at least a couple of weeks towards the end of April, first part of May. One of the reasons is UPRA is doing a convention somewhere in Kyiv. And I'll likely be there speaking. But also, if I'm going to come there, I'm not going to leave without trying to do some help and some good down east.
So what was your mission here in Ukraine?
So I came with a couple different missions. One is there's an organization I work with called United Refuge. It's an American-based organization. They also are working on registration within Ukraine. And a lot of what they do is, as you guys know, you know, one, the war's been going on since 2014, but especially since the major invasion in February of last year, you know, there's a lot of people who were, you know, truck drivers or insurance salesmen or worked in a grocery store who dropped everything and started doing humanitarian relief and helping their fellow countrymen down east. So what we try to do is help those organizations to get the supplies that they need, get plugged in with the UN, the major INGOs, and that type of thing. So while I was there, I was working with different groups, trying to get them plugged into the supplies that they need. But I also, for example, rented a warehouse down east so that 2 different actually Ukrainian organizations can use as a staging point. for distribution of supplies. You know, because that way you can use a tractor trailer to go from Kyiv or from the border all the way down east, unload everything, and then you can repackage it in the warehouse into food kits and all these other things, and split it all apart, which saves cost, logistics, time, because you know it takes a long time if you got to use sprinter vans to constantly run from Kyiv down east and that type of thing.
Does it
And
mean,
then,
excuse me, does it mean that you saw the war down east?
yes,
Mhm.
I mean, I got close enough to the lines that you could see artillery impacts and you could hear gunfire.
And what was your feeling?
It's kind of weird. I had a smile on my face because in my head, I'm like, it was a realization that there's nothing that can make my PTSD come back from Iraq.
So
I mean,
it's
it
been
was kind of, yeah, it's been 8 years since I went through the MDMA therapy.
and
And
since
since,
you never felt PTSD signs ever.
no, not at all. But also because my PTSD originated from combat, you know, like back when I had PTSD, a lot of things like fireworks, car backfiring, things like that would just totally mess me up. Well, now I don't have PTSD and those things don't bother me, but I also know that car backfiring is a car backfiring. It's
Mhm.
kind of different when we're talking about, you know, AK-47 small arms fire and artillery shells.
Yeah.
So I went down to some of the villages that are very close to the lines to deliver food and clothing and that type of thing. And I actually had a conversation with a soldier. I got it on videotape. You can clearly hear in the background small arms fire. And it's kind of funny because I watched that tape and I don't even flinch. And also, but I'll say, you know, when I went to Iraq, I didn't really know I had PTSD. It did become a problem until I came home. In part because a lot of aspects of PTSD keep you alive, hypervigilance, things like that. You know, not being able to sleep really deep because you got to be able to get up and react to whatever's going on around you. It's when you come home you realize it's a problem. So I was also curious after I came home, because I came back to the States January 11th, if I would have issues when I came back. And I actually didn't.
John, how do you think, is it the general problem for all the soldiers that come back from the war, or it's just some percentage of the total amount of people who keep the arms in hands, shoot people and then come back home? Some of them may have PTSD and some of them do not have.
It's a percentage. You know, not everybody gets it, but one of the things, and there's a lot of factors that play into whether someone will or will not develop PTSD. So, for example, myself, I had what's known as early childhood trauma, which is a really polite way of saying, you know, I was beaten up as a kid by my parents, specifically my mother. And so because of that, I was far more likely to develop PTSD later in life after I was exposed to trauma, which did occur. So a lot depends on like what your life has been up to that point. But another thing is, how long have you been on the front lines? What did you see? What happened to you and what your individual experiences are? Because everyone's individual experience in combat is different. You know, some people will go to combat and, for example, you know, your MiG fighter pilots, their experience is very different than a guy in a trench. And a guy in this trench, his experience is different than a guy in a trench over there. And PTSD also is not, whether you get it or not, is not a measure of how much trauma you experience. It's just different people react differently.
How did you realize that you have it when you came back?
So I knew that there was a problem because I kept hearing artillery impacts. Like I would go to sleep and I had nightmares and things like that. But they also told us, you know, some of that might happen. It's very likely to go away, which is very true. Just because one way to think about it is, let's take combat and all this out of the equation. Let's talk about a very simple trauma that lots of people can understand. Getting into a car accident. Let's say you get in a car accident. That's a traumatic event. It's very likely that you might have nightmares, hypervigilance, anxiety when driving for a couple of weeks following the accident. That's a normal reaction. That's your body processing and your mind processing that trauma. Where it becomes PTSD is when that never goes away. So when I came home, the nightmares and stuff, okay, then I started hearing helicopters and artillery impacts that weren't there. Now, it didn't help that I lived near a military base, so sometimes they were actually there, and that gets really bonkers when you're trying to figure out if it's real or not.
Mhm.
But also just horrific depression, survivor's guilt, having to live with the things you saw and things you did. Within 2 months of coming back from Iraq, I put a gun to my head and I pulled the trigger. There's an ammunition defect, which is why I'm still here. But throughout the 8-year period I had PTSD, I tried to take my life 8 times. And that doesn't count the hundreds of times I stood on a bridge and thought of jumping.
Can you say that the traditional system of psychological assistance in the United States was helpless at all?
In my case, yes, it was. Now, one, there's a mental health crisis in the United States. We don't have anywhere near enough therapists. I'm gonna just make an assumption that that Ukraine does not have enough therapists. They may have had enough therapists before the war, but with the entire country under attack, I mean, I was reading just this morning that they launched a barrage against 10 different cities.
Yeah, I actually woke up after an explosion. Yeah.
81 rocket missile was launched today.
Yeah, and so you have an entire country being traumatized. And so it's not just the people down in the east and in the south. It's not just people in Donetsk. It's not just the people in Kherson and that type of thing. It's the whole country. Just because you're in Kyiv doesn't mean you're safe, as you guys well know. I have a hard time saying that mental health can't work, because it is very effective for some people. And this is where my view has always been: there's lots of treatments, there's lots of modalities. They should all be on the table. And that way the individual person who's been traumatized can find what fits them best. For some people, EMDR is fantastic. For other people's subganglial block, it works. For some people, just doing talk therapy works. For some people, Zoloft is fine.
Can you describe the process of your healing from PTSD?
So none of the things I just described, although they do work for some people, works for me. And so the VA and mental health, their whole thing with me was basically, we're going to do triage and hopefully keep you alive. So every week I had therapy, and it was trying to just deal with my week. And so I found out about the MAPS trial, utilizing MDMA assisted therapy by accident. An intern, a student doctor, was filling in for my psychiatrist at the VA and slid this piece of paper across the desk, said, "Don't open this until you leave. I'm not supposed to tell you about it." And here I am trying to do like therapy and talk to the therapist. I'm like, what the hell's written on this piece of paper? Like, is she hitting on me? Is this a phone number? Like, I have no clue. Like, and I had a command sergeant major in the Army tell me I should go kill myself once. So it could have said that. I didn't know. So I go out and I open this piece of paper, and it says, Google MDMA PTSD. And I did. And I found out that right across the bridge, a few miles away, MAPS was doing a clinical trial using MDMA assisted therapy. I'm like, this sounds interesting. I know what ecstasy is. I'd never done it. The only drugs I had done up to that point was alcohol and cannabis. And I will say, I'll just throw in there, I used cannabis for 5 years to abate my suicidal ideation, and it was very effective. However, I had to stop using it when I moved to South Carolina. I went back on the pills, and that's what led to my last suicide attempt. But um, so my thought was, this is like everything else. It'll work for a little bit, and then everything's going to come back. But you know what? Taking MDMA before I off myself, like, sounds like a fantastic idea, because I had come to the conclusion that I was going to kill myself at some point. That was a foregone conclusion. That is how my life would end. And I'm like, for that, might as well go have some fun. And so I called them up, and I'm like, hey, I'm kind of crazy. They're like, what do you mean by crazy? So I tell them, they're like, you're totally are kind of crazy. And so because it's a clinical trial, like, I had to go do a psych eval, I had to go do like a physical and like all these other things. And once I passed all that, I was accepted into the trial. I was the 26th person in a 25-person trial. They were able to expand it by one because one person went through and had such profound healing in one session. He said he didn't need any more. And as a matter of fact, that individual was addicted to opiates prior to and had severe PTSD. The opiates was not because of the PTSD, although I'm sure that had an effect. It was more due to chronic pain. Guy did one session and was like, I'm good. I don't need any more. And he stopped using opiates. And as a matter of fact, it's very possible on one of my next trips over to Ukraine, he'll be coming with me. I've had a few people since I got back who've gone through psychedelic assisted therapy who are interested in coming over and doing humanitarian relief with me. In part because I think they want to do what I did, which is prove to yourself that you're cured and that this won't come back. But so I was accepted. We did some therapy sessions beforehand.
How many?
Some of so that gets kind of wonky because there were meetings that we had, like, for informed consent and all these other things. We had about 5 meetings before I took my first dose. I'd say about 3 of those were therapy sessions. 2 of those were more paperwork type things. And a lot of it was like, okay, let's talk about your trauma. Let's talk about like some of the stuff that's going on. So they had kind of an idea going in. And they're also, it helps build a rapport between you and the therapist and all of that. And then I showed up for, because one of the other things is you have to wean off of medications. So no cannabis, no Zoloft, no nothing. And that was done with doctor's approval and supervision. And then once I was weaned off everything, I went and I took my first dose. And it's funny because for some weird reason, and I think it's just because of how it's portrayed in media, I thought it would be instantaneous. Like, because in movies, like, they show the guy putting the dab on his tongue of LSD, and the next minute he's seeing, total crazy town stuff.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was instantaneous, and it didn't do anything. I'm like, well, maybe it's like cannabis, where it takes a minute or two. Still nothing. 30 minutes into this, I'm like, this shit sucks. I must have gotten the placebo. And then at about 40 minutes, it kicked in, and I'm like, oh, I totally get why people take this now. So, and like, they asked me to describe like what I was feeling, et cetera, et cetera. And, it was kind of funny. I said, I feel like I'm in a really tight wetsuit in a hot tub. And then one of my other very famous lines is, I said while I was under the influence. It's like doing therapy while being hugged by everyone who loves you in a bathtub full of puppies licking your face.
Yeah.
I did not say that when I was under the influence. That was just a line I said when somebody asked me, so what does it feel like? And that was the best explanation I could come up with.
And you had 2 specialists in the room during the session, yeah?
Correct. Michael and Annie Mithoff, who had specialized training and actually specialized licensing to be able to administer Schedule 1 and do the trials and all of that. The training will be required when this is FDA approved. All the extra licensing to research Schedule 1 will not. But And then they started asking me basic questions like, what was the weather like? Or, what was the food like? Which are simple questions you can ask any veteran, even if they have PTSD. And unless their PTSD is caused by the horrible food, which might be the case for the Russian soldiers, but like talking about food isn't going to trigger any. I call them kindergarten questions because it's the questions when you go talk to school. It's kindergarten ask. What was the weather like? What was, what's the food like? But it gets you started talking. And once you start talking, you don't really stop until so you'll talk for a bit, and then they'll have you put on eye shades, or in my case, I use sunglasses because I didn't like having the eye shades touching my eyeballs. And then you just think about everything you just talked about while listening to music. And one of the questions I have that I've thought about, especially since I got back from Ukraine, is so the music that they typically use and that they used with me was U.S. indigenous music.
Mm-hmm.
So Native Americans, although we're not supposed to use that term,
Yeah.
that kind of music. I'm curious, honestly, if traditional Ukrainian music may be better for Ukrainians simply because it's a different culture, or if the same kind of music I listen to is a benefit. That's more of a curiosity thing, but so you think about it for a while, and then they'll kind of say, what are you thinking about? And then you'll start talking again. And you just go through that cycle for the full 6 to 8 hours. You talk for a bit and you reflect for a bit, then you talk for a bit, reflect for a bit. And here's the weird thing, because let's be honest, I was on MDMA at the time. I have no real concept of time when I did the sessions.
Yeah.
So I could have talked for 5 minutes and contemplated for an hour, or I could have talked for an hour, contemplated for 5 minutes. They could have each been 15 minutes or 30 minutes. I honestly have no idea. Just because your whole sense of time just goes out the window.
And when did you get to the main point, to your PTSD during this session?
So for me, I had a lot of trauma in my life. So I went in thinking, hey, I'm just going to talk about Iraq. You talk about all the trauma in your whole life. So I talked about Iraq. I talked about my early childhood. I talk about my brother and his addiction, and when he used to abuse me. I talked about getting bullied in high school, even anything in my life that was traumatic. I just talked about it. So I talked about very different things in all 3 sessions. There's kind of 2 different responses, for lack of a better term. You'll have some people, like the gentleman who did 1 session and then was done. He had an aha moment. Whatever was causing his PTSD, he dealt with it. Boom, it was over. With me, because I had so much trauma throughout my life, every time I did it, it was kind of like if you have a clogged drain and you pour down drain cleaner, cleans out a little bit. You pour down some more, cleans out some more. Pour down more, cleans it all out. That was more how it was for me. I saw incremental healing after each session. Some people, they just have this aha moment in one of the sessions and they're good.
What was the main idea after the first session that you could take with you after the session, after the MDMA?
Well, one of them was that all the things I saw and did, it was okay and it wasn't my fault. And all the people involved, including myself, were put there by other people.
Yeah.
And what was the delay between the sessions? It was
about a month. So for me, so the standard protocol is right at 30 days. When I went through, I was going to college at the time, and I didn't want to go do MDMA therapy on Sunday and then have to do finals all week or something, because you're very contemplated for about a week following. So I actually set it up to work with the breaks in my school schedule. So mine were about a month and a half apart.
Mm-hmm.
And I still technically had PTSD when I finished the full protocol. It just took a little bit longer for me to be able to work all that out. But I only did the 3 sessions. And I think part of it was, even after I had done it, I was still convinced it was temporary.
Hmm.
And did
And-
you ever believed that it is not?
I absolutely, I know it, that the temporary relief is now permanent. I mean, here I am over 8 years later. I've now been healed of PTSD longer than I had it.
And
So
since then, you did not consume the MDMA.
no, I only consumed MDMA 3 times in my life as part of that trial.
And what was the moment then when you felt that it's over? It's over.
It's over. The moment where I knew it was over permanently,
Yeah.
honestly, was into nuts. I always had a doubt.
Mhm.
And going back to a combat zone proved it to myself. But I also knew a long time ago that I didn't have to do that. I mean, I wanted to do that, and it likely wouldn't have come back, you know, like, even if that would have triggered it, nothing in the US really would have triggered it. I've known that for years, in part because I pushed myself towards triggers. Things would happen. Like, I've done CPR on 2 people who both passed, not because of anything I did, but they died in my arms. And I went and I talked to a therapist about it for about 6 weeks, and I was fine. That's where I knew how resilient I was.
Do you use the help of usual psychotherapist at the moment, or you don't?
I don't. I have a therapist that I use on an as needed basis. So, for example, when I came back from Ukraine, I did a couple therapy sessions and just talked about what I saw and processed it and that type of thing. Because, like, it's heartbreaking to see kids living in those conditions and experiencing that. You know, kids is one of the things that really messed me up in Iraq. But there's also an unbelievable amount of admiration because, I mean, you guys know the people who are living down there could very easily leave. You know, there's lots of people who did, and they're sitting there saying, fuck that. This is my place. I'm not leaving. And that takes an enormous amount of fortitude.
Yeah.
Tell us
But,
about.
you know,
Tell us about.
sorry, go on.
Yeah, how did you become involved in maps?
So after I went through the therapy, well, my original involvement was, you know, being a trial participant, and then I started working on political campaigns in the United States and working with politicians, which is something I had an interest in, but I couldn't really do when I had PTSD. So when you're working on campaigns, it's kind of funny. So one of the things I did, it's known as advance work. So I would go and help set everything up so that when the politician arrives, they just get up on stage, they give their speech. And when they get up on stage, I go take the other vehicle and drive to the next location and set things up. So you spend a lot of time after everything's set up just hanging out. And you've got this whole group of press people who follow everywhere, right?
Mhm.
Well, you can't talk about like campaign stuff with the press because you just don't do that. So you just talk about like random stuff. A lot of people talk about sports or you know, hey, did you see the latest Game of Thrones or what have you? I'd be like, so I used to have PTSD and I went through this crazy thing, and I'd tell them about it, and they started doing news stories about it. And then Rick Doblin at Maps called me up and said, hey, you're talking to all these politicians about your story. How about we pay you to do that? And I said, I'm down. And that's how I started, you know, working with Maps. I have my own actual political consulting firm. They're one of my clients. I have 2 other clients who are involved in the psychedelic space, Apollo Pact ApolloPac.org, which is a patient and participant advocacy organization, and then VETS, Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions. They send Americans down to Mexico to do Ibogaine 5-MeO DMT therapy. They've sent, I believe, around 600 or 700 people down there to do that. And then, well, as you guys know, when I come over to Ukraine, I tend to talk a little bit of policy on psychedelics while I'm there.
Yeah.
And one of my goals, actually, that I'm working on trying to find funding for is to set up Ibogaine therapy clinics in Western Ukraine in the Carpathians to treat civilians, veterans, and active duty troops within Ukraine, so that those people who have PTSD can heal and live their life and, you know, be okay.
But they can't do this now because it's illegal.
Ibogaine is legal.
There you go. That's why I'm using Ibogaine, because the long-term plan, if I can make all this work, is to use the Ibogaine therapy to train therapists so that when MDMA assisted therapy becomes approved in the US, it changes the rules in Ukraine on MDMA assisted therapy. So we'll have a cohort of therapists trained in psychedelic assisted therapy. So as different substances become legal in Ukraine, those therapists can fall right in and start using those if that's the best modality for the patient. But until then, we can use Ibogaine because it is legal. Ketamine is also legal. Those can be done now, and setting up the clinics and the infrastructure now and getting the therapists trained now means that when this is over, we can heal a country.
What can you say if, for example, a dozen of Ukrainian vets will decide to help themselves with MDMA therapy? How can we help them?
So that can have very tragic consequences. Yes, there's the elephant in the room is people use these substances for fun. We all know this, like that's part of the reason why the government has a problem with it. If you're doing it for fun, it's one thing. If you are doing it to heal trauma, you need to have therapists involved. Now that if you have trained therapists who are willing to do it on the underground and take that risk, that is far safer than doing it without a therapist. Because as an example, a long time ago, there were two women who Rick Doblin found out about. And he tells this story over and over again. Both of them went to a festival. Both of them did MDMA pretty much at the same time. One of them, they'd both been, I believe, sexually assaulted. And by doing the MDMA, it brought up a whole bunch of things. One of the people went to their friend and said, "Hey, I'm having problems." They went, found a quiet place, sat, and they talked. That person found a lot of great benefit from that. Wasn't planned, it just happened. The other person didn't want to bother her friends, so she didn't say it or anything. She didn't talk about it, and within a week, she committed suicide. So this isn't about just taking the medication. The medication is like anesthesia. You know, if you need a surgery and you go do the anesthesia, you still need the surgery. And the anesthesia puts the mind and body in the place it needs to be so the surgeon can do their work. That's a really good analogy because the therapy is what fixes things.
Yeah, but
it wasn't the MD.
The place.
Yeah, it wasn't the.
Excuse me, this time lag. I mean, not. I mean, if there anywhere in the world are the places where those people can do it in proper way with therapists.
Oh, okay. I misunderstood the question. I apologize.
No.
And the reason is
it was very useful information, I think.
Because I do worry. You know, people hear my story and they hear, "Hey, I did MDMA and it fixed me," and they forget the therapy part. So I have a lot of concern when people hear my story that they think, oh, I can just go do MDMA and I'm going to be fixed like him. And that can lead to a lot of problems. So currently, MDMA assisted therapy is not legal anywhere on the planet. However, within a year, that should change. We're looking at FDA approval in the United States, hopefully first or second quarter of next year. A lot of that depends on how much negotiating has to go on with the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration.
Yeah.
And so the good thing is America is like the big dog on the block when it comes to drug policy. So when we make changes on the federal level, a lot of other countries follow suit. For example, there's dozens of countries around the world that if something is FDA approved in the United States, it's automatically approved in that country. For example, when MDMA is rescheduled by the United States to at least Schedule 2, it falls into a different legal realm within Ukraine. So, as I'm sure you guys are very well aware, Ukraine has some very interesting drug laws that are legacies of the Soviet era.
Yeah.
And so, even if I wanted, I can't. So, for example, MAPS, me, whoever, can't even conduct clinical trials on MDMA in Ukraine because it's a Schedule 1 narcotic and it's not allowed in the country, period.
But if
But
Ukraine
if
veterans goes to United States.
So well, here's the thing. Once the United States reschedules MDMA and allows it for prescription, it will actually be able to import it into Ukraine to start trials in Ukraine because it's now Schedule 2, not Schedule 1.
That would be a great day.
Yeah.
It will be, but hopefully first part of next year, yes, Ukrainians would be able to come to the United States, assuming they, can get permission to leave and travel to the United States to do MDMA assisted therapy. There's also very likely that very rapidly after the US FDA approves it, it will be approved in Canada. Australia just authorized compassionate use. So within a year or two, there will be dozens of countries that people will be able to go to do MDMA assisted therapy. Ibogaine assisted therapy can be done right now in Ukraine. And I'm actually hoping within 2 years to be able that we will see MDMA assisted therapy in Ukraine.
What is your technology, I can say, to rise this specialists in psychedelic assisted therapy in this medical center or recovery center in Carpathian that you mentioned? So
the training consists of academic work, so things like taking various classes. Not sure if there's any papers that have to be written, and then the final exam, for lack of a better term, is actually doing therapy on a patient under supervision of a certified therapist. So the first step would be to get a small cohort, say 6 therapists that are Ukrainian who have very high credentials and are very fluent in English and Ukrainian, in part so that they can take all the material and translate it into Ukrainian, because I love Ukraine, but I cannot speak Ukrainian to save my life. And so those 6 people, the hope is that they will kind of train the trainers. So they will be certified to be able to train therapists.
Do they have to have the medical education?
They don't have to be an MD. And so there should be a medical doctor involved, in part to do some medical pre-screening prior to somebody undergoing Ibogaine therapy. There's some heart issues with Ibogaine in particular that you just need to, they need to check up on some things to make sure it's safe for the person to do it. So an MD will be involved. They won't necessarily be the therapist providing the therapist training. qualifications to become a therapist trainer, like I'm talking about. I mean, yeah, a psychiatrist would qualify. So would somebody with extensive years worth of experience as a therapist. They would have to be licensed.
But we have no license in Ukraine for therapists. Everyone can say that he is a therapist and be therapist. That's the trouble.
Wow. Okay.
He means
So
psychologist, not
yeah.
psychotherapist.
So part of that, yeah. So part of that would be like MDs, psychiatrists, PhD in psychology. Because you don't have a license, a lot of it would probably rely on experience and education. So if you have somebody who's gone to a Ukrainian university and is a clinical social worker, for example, and they've been doing that for 10 years,
Mhm.
they would very much qualify. If you're somebody who walks down the street and says, I'm a therapist because I like talking to people, they would not qualify. Somebody who just graduated as a social worker would not qualify to be a train the trainer. They would qualify to be trained. And those are two different things. You have the trainers and then you have the people who are trained. So the trainers would probably have a higher like threshold of qualifications than somebody being trained to do it. But once we have that cohort of trainers, like I said, the final exam is doing psychedelic assisted therapy. So every time they treat a patient, they would be able to actually like certify a new set of therapists. So every patient who's healed gives you 2 trained therapists. And that's how you can rapidly build this cohort if there's enough people interested in being trained. And I'll be honest, in talking with UPRA and others within Ukraine who had never even heard of UPRA, but that I ran into and were interested due to conversations we had, I don't think we'll ever run out of therapists to train. And the more we have trained, the more therapists we train, the more people we're healing. But also part of this is going to be a study. We're going to track results. For example, if soldiers who were at the military mental hospital that I visited end up going and being treated and they're fine and they want to go back to the front lines and fight, we should be tracking. We should see if they run into problems. Is it like me when I went down there where I didn't have problems, or did the PTSD come right back? And by tracking all these different metrics and getting all this data, the hope is that, that will give us the information that we need to approach the Ukrainian government to change laws or to provide licensing or permits or whatever to allow the study and use of these substances. Because even if the war stopped tomorrow, let's say, knock on wood, Putin has a heart attack and everybody pulls out.
It would be great.
There's still millions of people with PTSD in Ukraine. And so this will take years, if not decades, to fix.
Absolutely. And can you please give us one more time the links for this initiative? How can we find it? Maybe.
So, yeah, right now I don't even have a website. It's an idea in my head that I'm talking to wealthy Americans who have more money than we could ever imagine. It's kind of funny. These are American oligarchs. We just don't use that term. To get funding to be able to do this. So I don't have a website. As soon as I have a website, I will absolutely let you know. But hopefully I can come up with funding in the next few months to at least fund this for the next 2 years.
And in your plans, do you have the date of opening of the center?
No, because that depends entirely on funding and training schedule. Because one of the things that will have to happen before we can open any centers is we've got to get that initial 6 therapists, and it could be more, it could be less. They're going to need to leave Ukraine and then come to the US. I believe they're currently looking at doing a training in Iceland. And honestly, a lot of the training can be done on the line through Zoom and things like that. That's how a lot of people do it. But there is like a week or two, like in-person thing that you have to do.
So they are
Um,
all women.
um,
At the moment.
well, and that's an interesting question. If we're talking about a military psychiatrist who happens to be male, we could make an argument to the government to allow him to leave the country for 2 weeks, to go for training. I mean, there's a lot of people in your government that leave the country because they have to go do training or meet with peers in other countries to advance the war effort. And I do believe this is helping Ukraine defend itself.
Absolutely.
But whoever, and also there's other people who actually can leave who are male because they're not fit for military service due to injuries or things like that. So once we get in so part of it will depend on what dates training is available, what training we can get the people into. Once they're trained, then we can start talking about opening a center.
Great.
But you've got to have that initial cohort of train the trainers before you set that up. And then, then we can start healing people and then hopefully get therapists trained in addition to that, as well as collecting all this data. I mean, I'll be honest, the reason I came up with this is because, I was just over there and I saw the look in people's eyes, and it was the same look I had when I had PTSD. And so I want to help people who are suffering the way I was. That's my motivation. That's why I'm doing it. All the rest of this, like the data collection and all this stuff, that's honestly so I can convince people to support it and get the funding and all of that. But I genuinely just want to help the people who are feeling the way I used to, because I know how that feels.
Yeah, it's very motivating because when you touch to this possibility to heal, and you know that it is here, it is, and you want to share.
John, here in our Ukrainian psychedelic community, we regard such cases as yours like the most efficient instruments to get rid of stereotypes and to make some people think about this alternative way to get the healing. And I wanted to ask you about how about American veterans to whom you I'm sure talk to, how they feel about the future perspective to get the healing with the help of MDMA. Is it like a popular idea? Do you find some eager in this community, or it's like people who
It's actually
skeptical about this?
So when it comes to veterans, I haven't really heard anybody be skeptical. There are people who will freely admit they don't understand it and they don't understand how it works, but they can't argue with the fact that it does. And it's kind of funny. You also have a bunch of veterans who are like, I don't want to take that. Why don't they just let me smoke weed? Like, okay, working on that too, brother. They're not mutually exclusive. You can, if smoking cannabis is what you need, you can entirely do that. Don't deny other people what they need. A lot of them are annoyed that it's taking as long as it is. And you have, as I said earlier, a lot of this is about the therapy. If you don't do the therapy, you're just doing drugs. And there's a lot of people who think, hey, if I just do mushrooms, it fixes me. They don't do the therapy part. They don't do the integration. And so what happens is, like anesthesia and a surgery, yeah, they feel great under the anesthesia, might make them feel great a little bit after, but they still need the surgery. And so, and the other thing is, because of the reputation, because of the party drug aspect, there's also a bunch of veterans who are like, I totally want to volunteer for this. And it's funny because they won't admit they have PTSD and they want help, but they'll say they're very eager to just go try drugs. Um, and whatever gets them onto the therapist's couch will help them heal. But it is kind of funny how many people want to volunteer because it involves MDMA.
I think we've got all the time we had. So
Yeah, and we can, and also anytime you guys want to like have me on and do a podcast, just let me know.
Cool.
And you know, I can get up early in the morning, because I know it's like 7-8 hours. It's actually kind of makes it a lot easier for me to do work in Ukraine while I'm still here and stay in contact with everyone, because I got the cutest little dog in the world.
and you have a very interesting map on the wall.
Yeah. Wow.
Wow.
So that's my little pup. Yeah, I have a Ukrainian flag hanging there, and the reason I have the map of Ukraine is because like when I talk to people on like Slack or WhatsApp or Signal or on the phone, I'm still learning geography in Ukraine.
Mhm.
So they're ticking off cities or oblasts and regions and stuff like this, and in my head I'm like, I know what Ukraine looks like. I know where Kyiv is in relation to that, but I don't know where the hell you're talking about. So I got a map, put it up on the wall, so when I'm on the phone and they're talking about like different towns, I know where they're talking about, because a lot of the stuff work I do is logistics, getting things from point A to point B. So one of the things I actually did, one of the last things I did before I left the country, and it actually finished up after I got back, is an American did a very amazing thing. Went to a bunch of hospitals and other places and got about $2 million worth of medical supplies, which filled 4 ocean containers, for Ukraine and for the front lines and the hospitals. And he shipped them to Ukraine like you would mail a letter, without realizing that there's customs and all those things. So Polish customs is like, what the hell? And the shipper was actually going to give it to the Polish Red Cross, which means none of that would have ever seen inside Ukraine. So interestingly enough, a friend of mine worked for the shipper and called me, and he's like, hey, do you know anything about this organization? I'm like, no, what's this about? He's like, there's these 4 containers. I'm like, I'm in the vehicle right now with the people who are supposed to be getting it. What can we do? And I was able to get it cleared through customs and get it transported into Ukraine. And for the past 3 weeks, the supplies have been being distributed down at the front lines to combat medics, transfer points, hospitals, that type of thing.
This is a great case.
Yeah, but a lot of what I do is logistics. It's getting stuff from point A to point B. So I do a lot of phone stuff, and it does make it easier that like my dog gets up at 6 a.m. to go to the bathroom. And then I start checking on Ukraine. Most stuff here in the US doesn't start, for me at least, doesn't start till like 10 or 11 a.m. So I get to put in like 5 or 6 hours in Ukraine before I even start my regular job. And then when I'm in Ukraine, it just flips. I work a full day, and then I flip open my laptop at the end of the day and do some work. But yeah, that's why I got the map there.
And when do you plan to visit Ukraine one more time, or you don't?
Oh no, so I actually plan on coming back to Ukraine at least 3 times this year. The next one will probably be late April, first part of May, for 2-3 weeks. In part because I want to be there for the conference to be able to speak in person. And if I'm going to be there, like if I'm going to fly across the Atlantic, I'm staying for a while. Like I'm not going to do all the stuff to get to Kyiv to be there for 1 or 2 days and then turn around and come back. Because I mean, as I'm sure you guys are aware, it takes a couple of days to like get from Kyiv.
Hard road, yeah.
So like, especially because I fly in military airplanes as a retiree, so that makes it a little easier. But I fly into Ramstein, Germany, and get on a train to Berlin, and there's only one train from Berlin to Jemish, to the border. So
Okay, you're welcome in Ukraine anytime.
Looking
Oh,
forward
I'm looking forward to
in
it.
flash. And we
I
hope
actually, I miss the borscht.
Okay.
we hope your map on the wall will soon become yellow in the whole without red territory in the east and south. And we
One
wait.
day.
Yeah, we wait to see you here in Ukraine, and maybe till that time we'll have another topic to talk in our podcast.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank
For
you
your help.
For your help. Thank you for your help and for your story. It was inspiring, and I hope it will inspire many people to change these rules. We can't hear you because you put down the phone.
One of my earbuds fell out. I figured
Yeah.
I'd be fine with one, but apparently not. No, I'm here and available for anything I can help with. I will talk to whomever you think I should, who you think I may be able to convince, or even if I can't convince them because they need to hear it. Anything I can do to help, whether it be in the psychedelic field or anything else. And I want you guys to stay safe, and keep doing this podcast and dodge the missiles as best you can.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Have a good day.
You too. Great talking to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao.
Psychedelia Podcast.